and welcome back to Books and Things. Today I'm going to do a June wrap-up video, so I'm going to take you through all the books I've read in June. So without any further ado, let's begin. Back in May for my birthday, my friend Celine made me this jar of reading challenges. So the idea is that every month I open one of these slips of paper and it has a different reading challenge for me to do for the month. My reading challenge for the month of June was to read a book by an author I'd never read before, and I did this quite a lot. So I think 6 of the books I read this month are by authors I've never come across before. So first off, I'm going to go through my book club books. I belong to 2 different book clubs. One is a general fiction book club and the other is a science fiction one. So for my science fiction book club this month, I read The Fifth Head of Cerberus by Gene Wolfe. This is sort of a collection of short stories, sort of a novel. There's 3 different stories in this, but they all take place in the same world. I quite liked it. Basically, I really liked the first story, and I quite liked the third, but I found the second one quite dry. So it's set on this alternative world, which is kind of a colony planet for humans. So at some point in the past, humans came to this planet and wiped out the natives, or so everyone believes. However, one of the central aspects of this book is that there is this scholar who believes that maybe the people on this planet who think they're humans aren't actually humans, and maybe the natives wiped out the humans when they came there and took their place. And it's one of those books I found more interesting than I did enjoyable. I thought there were a lot of really interesting ideas, but I didn't always find it that engaging or exciting to read. For my general fiction book club this month, I read Sex and Stravinsky by Barbara Trapido. I did a full review of this on my blog, which I will link down below. I quite liked this. Again, I'm kind of divided on it. I really liked the characters, I loved the writing. The writing is brilliant, and I really liked the narrative structure, but I just wasn't really convinced by the plot. There were a lot of coincidences, and I love Dickens, so my threshold for coincidences is very high, but the ending felt very contrived and a bit ridiculous, and I kind of stopped believing in it by the end. But I'm definitely going to look out for something else written by Trapido, because I do really like her writing style, and I'd be interested to read something else that she's written. On to the other novels that I read in June. The next book I read was Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I've been meaning to read for ages, and I finally got round to it. I really liked this. I thought this was a very interesting book. It's set in the psychiatric ward of a hospital in the 1960s, and if you're interested in mental health and that period in history and the experience of people at that time, it's really well worth reading. And also, it's just a really well written book. I think it would interest most people. The characters are very well done, and I like the narrative voice, especially the way it develops throughout the book and kind of changes over the course of the story. The next book I read was Down the Rabbit Hole by Juan Pablo Villabus. I'm sorry if I haven't said that name right. I definitely don't think I have. Basically, this book's about a 7-year-old boy whose father is a Mexican drug baron, and we see everything that's going on, all this kind of crazy violent stuff, through the eyes of this 7-year-old boy. And I did like it. Sometimes the child does seem quite a lot older than 7, and I know that he's being exposed to a lot of things that most 7-year-olds wouldn't, but I wasn't always convinced by his age. I thought his voice was very good in creating a distinct character, but not necessarily a character that was 7 years old. He felt more like 10, 11 at times. I've done a full review of this on my blog, which I will link down below. The next novel I read was NP by Banana Yoshimoto. I spoke about Banana Yoshimoto in my last wrap-up video. I discovered her this year and think she's brilliant. I love her. She's a Japanese author who writes brilliant, beautiful books, and like all my other copies of Banana Yoshimoto, I have tons and tons of post-it notes down the side because she just writes the most beautiful language. I really liked NP. I wouldn't say it's my favourite Banana Yoshimoto book. I think Kitchen and Goodbye Guzumi I preferred. Part of the reason why was because I felt like there was just too much in this book for the size of it. It might just be because I read it all in one sitting. I did read it in just a couple of hours, so maybe that was why it felt so intense. But this book deals with so many things. It deals with grief, it deals with suicide, it deals with mental illness, it deals with incest, it deals with friendship, it deals with family. It just deals with so many things, and I felt like the book couldn't always contain the amount of sheer stuff that was in this book. I thought it was brilliant, but it wouldn't be my favourite Banana Yoshimoto. However, I'm still going to carry on my mission to read everything she's ever written because I think she's brilliant. I also read 2 YA books in June. The first one was Dare to Dream by Karis Jones, which the author sent me a copy of to do a review. I did a full review of that on my blog, which I'll link down below. I quite liked this. I thought the premise was good, and I thought some of the characters were quite interesting, but I had a problem with some of the pacing. I thought the first half of the book felt quite slow, and then the second half of the book felt too fast. However, this is the first one in a trilogy, so it may be that that what seems irrelevant in the first half of the book may go on to be really important later, so I will save my judgment of it till later. The other YA book I read is Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare, which is the first one in the Infernal Devices trilogy. I didn't actually finish it in June, I finished it a couple of days later, but I read the bulk of it in June and I finished it now, so I'm still going to talk about it here. I absolutely love this. I think it's possibly my favourite YA thing I've ever read, which is possibly just because there's lots of Dickens references in it. I'm not going to lie, that did sway me. However, I think they're well written and quite interesting. I like the premise, I like the world, I really like the characters. I haven't read Mortal Instruments yet. I'm starting with Infernal Devices because my friend Celine told me I would like them because of how Victorian they are, and she's right. I enjoy the Victorianness very much. I think what I really like is the characters. I find most of them plausible and interesting and quite complex. Tess is a great character, as are Will and Jem, who I love, but I also like that the less central characters are quite interesting too. I also really like Jessamine. I think she's possibly my favourite character. As someone that's interested in the Victorian period and especially gender roles in it, I found Jessamine quite believable and just very interesting because I think that is exactly how a Victorian woman would behave, and she has this problem. She can't find a way to match her identity as a warrior with her identity as a typical Victorian lady, which she's been brought up to be. The only little criticism I have is that I didn't necessarily believe the motives of some of the kind of villains, but I will see how the series unrolls, and I'm really, really looking forward to reading the rest of the trilogy. I also read some short stories this month. I read Jennifer Egan's Emerald City and Other Stories. I really like Jennifer Egan. I read her Visit from the Goon Squad earlier on this year and thought it was brilliant, and so I was really excited when I saw this. This is definitely my favourite thing I read this month. It is incredible. These short stories are brilliant. They are so powerful and amazing. I can't even... Genuinely, there was not a single story where I didn't get to the end and was almost in tears. I don't know how she does it. It was all brilliant. There's 11 stories in this collection and they're all really different. They range in setting from China to New York, and their narrators are anyone and everyone from 15-year-old girls to middle-aged men, and it deals with love and money and adultery and growing up and identity and so many things. I think my favourite stories were Emerald City and also One Piece, which I thought was brilliant. Really, really lovely. What a book. This was so good. I sincerely recommend this, and even if you're not into short stories or you think you're not into short stories, you will be when you read this. So good. I cannot recommend this enough. I also read some poetry this month, the selected poems of Yue Fanthorpe. I first discovered her on GCSE when I studied 2 of her poems, and then after her death in 2009, all of her poems went out of print and I couldn't find them anywhere. And I apparently didn't know that the internet existed back then, so I didn't manage to find any of her books. But I found this selected works of her poems in October and I've only just got around to reading it. I really like her poetry. I think it's very approachable and accessible and very funny. I like that she has a lot of literary references, especially to Shakespeare, who I love. There's a series of poems where she takes a lot of female characters in Shakespeare and tries to write about what their side of the story is. I really enjoyed this. It was lovely to read some poetry again because I really enjoy poetry and I often forget about it and don't read enough. The final book I read in June was The Selected Letters of Jane Austen. I absolutely loved this. I found it fascinating and lovely and enjoyable and moving to read, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. You have to be pretty into Jane Austen to find this enjoyable. It's not an easy read, it's quite a slow one. Obviously, because these are her letters to her family and friends, there's a lot of stuff in there that doesn't quite make sense without notes. So although at the back of the book there's a lot of notes and there's also a list of people that appear in her letters, it does mean it's quite a slow read because you have to keep on flicking back to the book to make sure you're getting it. However, it's really nice to read something a bit different written by Jane Austen and to get a sense of her everyday view of life. There's also a few absolutely beautiful, lovely letters in there. My favourite letters in the book were those in the second half where her books are starting to be published and she's talking about what she thinks of them. She refers to Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice as her babies and her children, which is just quite nice. There's also quite a lot of letters from her to her niece Anna, who was writing a book at the time, and we can see Jane Austen's edits and suggested feedback on the book, which is really interesting because you get to see Jane Austen's thoughts on writing and what she thought was good writing and bad writing and what she would suggest, which I really enjoyed. However, I wouldn't recommend reading her selected letters unless you either know a lot about her life or have read a biography of Jane Austen, just because without that it's quite hard to follow. If you do love Jane Austen as much as me and you want to know more about her life, then I would recommend her letters, but first I would recommend reading a biography of her. The one I most recommend is Claire Tomalin's Jane Austen, A Life, which is very good and very detailed, and I found that very readable as well. As a massive admirer of Jane Austen, I loved reading her letters, but I don't recommend them unless you're very, very keen. So I think that's pretty much it. Those are all the books I read in June. If you've read any of these books, please let me know what you thought of them down in the comments, and also if you have any recommendations for me. Have a good week, and in the meantime, happy reading.